This individual man, then, which absolute being has revealed itself to be, accomplishes in himself as an individual the movement of sensuous being. He is the immediately present God. Consequently, his being passes over into having been. Consciousness, for which God is thus sensuously present, ceases to see and to hear him. It has seen and heard him, and it is because it only has seen and heard him that it first becomes itself spiritual consciousness. Or in other words, just as formerly he rose up for consciousness as a sensuous existence, now he has arisen in the spirit. For a consciousness that sensuously sees and hears him is itself a merely immediate consciousness, which has not overcome the disparity of objectivity, has not taken it back into pure thought. It knows this objective individual, but not itself as spirit. In the vanishing of the immediate existence known to be absolute being, the immediacy receives its negative moment. Spirit remains the immediate self of actuality, but as the universal self-consciousness of the religious community, a self-consciousness which reposes in its own substance, just as in it this substance is a universal subject. Not the individual by himself, but together with the consciousness of the community and what he is for this community, is the complete whole of the individual as spirit. Paragraph 763 is now going to bring together some of the elements that were being put on the table in the earlier paragraph 762, and also before that we see talk about the community, which we can understand, as Miller does put in the brackets, to be the religious community. We have the worshiper, the believer, and then we have the einzelne Mensch, the individual human. In this case, translating the individual human as this individual man makes sense because we're talking here about Jesus Christ for Christianity, which Hegel takes to be the ultimate religion, right? And so we have three main, we could call them not elements, but rather manifestations of spirit. And spirit is in all of these, but it's not there yet in its notion, as we're going to see, as we saw in the previous paragraph, making this analogy to the consciousness section where we have, the immediate self, the immediate consciousness that's sensuous, that's oriented towards the things that present themselves, sense certainty, right? Then we have getting a bit more metaphysical, getting a bit more epistemological, getting more sophisticated, the thing and its properties. We go back and forth. And then we get this massive brain killer section of force and the understanding. Well, we're going to have something like that going on here. And so this is really the first part of the progress towards that. So he tells us this individual man, this einzelne Mensch, which absolute being has revealed itself to be, accomplishes, fulfills is another way, fullendet, right? In himself as an individual, the movement of sensuous being. So there's something happening on this side of the Christ figure, the Jesus guy who's there. And then there's also something happening correlatively on the part of consciousness, the consciousness of the believer. So he goes on and he says, he is the immediately, and lots of immediacy here, right? Unmediated. He is the unmediated present, gegenwärtige, right? So present both in the sense of like being present to people, being like in their face, you could say, being available, and also present, you could say, temporally. And this is where we get into some interesting implications for temporality and time that are going to be spelled out a little bit more in the next paragraph and those following. So immediately present God. And then Hegel says, and this is a transition where we might be like, wait a second. Consequently, because he's present, he has to pass over into this other thing. Well, again, think of sense certainty. What happened when we were trying to understand the here and the now? The here remains here in this spot, but the now sure as hell doesn't, because by the time that you've said now, you're already past that present moment, and the now has become past. Something like that is happening here with this figure. Being, sein, the sein of Jesus turns into a having been, gewesen sein. And, this makes perfect sense if you think about it. And we're going to talk about this gewesen sein in two different ways. So he says, consequent consciousness, which for God is thus sensuously present, ceases to see and to hear him. Why? Well, Jesus leaves the room. Now you're not seeing him. Now you're dependent on what you actually remember. Think of a prime example in Matthew, right? Jesus preaches the Sermon on the Mount, this absolutely central piece of Christian doctrine, or at least it ought to be for anybody who calls themselves a Christian. By the way, when people start talking about the book of Revelations or Leviticus, and they say, I'm a Christian, I stand with Jesus, I always say, how you doing with the Sermon on the Mount? Because that is pretty much the most definitive teaching that he provided. If you're not doing that, you're not a Christian. You're actually Antichrist. So there's some interesting things there that we could plumb. But think about this. So you're at the Sermon on the Mount. You're one of these people who's listening to this guy in the rowboat. Hopefully he's got a loud voice, or maybe people in the crowd are repeating what he's saying to you. And you're hearing these interesting things that are being said. And you're like, wow, that's some awesome teaching. I'm glad I got to see God face to face and to hear what he has to say. This is awesome. And then Jesus retires with his apostles. He's going to go have, a meal with them. And you're going back to your tent and you're like, wow, that was such an awesome experience. What exactly did he say? I hope somebody wrote this down, or I hope somebody will write this down somewhere. I'm trying to remember. I think I've got a lot. And you say, do you remember exactly what he said? You're piecing something together. That is now past, right? And that's an understanding thing. That's not even the seeing and hearing. So it says, it has seen and heard him, and it is because it only has seen and heard him that it first becomes itself spiritual consciousness. And that's on the side of the believer, on the side of the figure. In other words, just as he rose up formerly for consciousness as a sensuous existence, now he has arisen in the spirit, aufgestanden, right? It's both words. Both terms are the same there. Arising. It's a different form of arising. Coming up. Standing up, literally, standing oneself up. So, what does this actually mean for us? So he says, a consciousness that sensuously, sinnliche, right, sees and hears him is a merely immediate consciousness, which has not overcome the disparity of objectivity, has not taken it back into pure thought. That's where we're trying to go with this. Pure thought, the concept, not just representation, not just sensuous perception or something like that. Something that really takes root within a human being, but also within them as part of a community, and within the community as part of them, and Christ in all of them. That's part of what is going on here. So a consciousness that only sensuously sees and hears is merely immediate, and it hasn't gone to pure thought. It knows this objective individual, but not itself as spirit. So this is, you could say, foreshadowing what's going to be happening. What's wrong with knowing God as spirit, as Geist, but not knowing oneself as spirit? Well, for a lot of ways of looking at religion, this would actually be ideal. Think about the unhappy consciousness, which we went through, in the self-consciousness section, which has been referenced quite a bit in this particular part of the religion portion of the work. For that, there was a tornness, right? On the one hand, the eternal God is way off there, the beyond, the jenseits, right? And we miserable worms are over here, but we're lucky in that we get to be related to that. We don't yet realize that that gap between us is a product of our own creation. a reflection of our own lack of complete spiritual, geistige, development. What do? Well, for Hegel, and this is where some religious people are going to jump ship, you can say, the goal is for us to realize that we are spirit too, not just Christ, not just God the Father or God the Trinity, or pick whatever you want. We worshipers are also that, right? And so this is part of the reconciliation or the overcoming of alienation and separateness that is going to come about. And that has to happen through something else for Hegel. This is not something that the individual does all by himself in a heroic way, going off. Even the monks in the desert didn't do it on their own. Even the hermits going off by themselves exist within a community of saints, right? They're not saying, I'm so cool, I can be God on my own, just me and Jesus all alone. That thing about walking on the seashore that Christians have, When I was, one time I saw myself, these paths walking along, and there's two sets of footprints, and then there's only one set of footprints. What did you do, Jesus? You left me behind, you abandoned me. And then Jesus says, no, I carried you at that time. None of that for Hegel. It's within the matrix of the community. This is absolutely important for Hegel. So he goes on and he says, it doesn't know itself as spirit. How can it come to know itself as spirit? In the vanishing of the immediate existence known to be absolute being, right, Wesen, the immediacy receives its negative moment. Yeah, a very typical Hegelian thing. The negative comes in here and plays a role. There's more than what's going on in immediacy. The opposite, of course, of immediacy is mediation. Lots of mediation going on here. Where can the mediation happen the most? In the community, right? The community which provides a locus, a support. This should make us think back to the earlier sections, right? This long development that took place in the earlier sections of religion, the discussion of the cult. Wasn't that so important? That was community, wasn't it? And this is community, but in a different way as well. So he goes on and he says, spirit remains the immediate self of actuality, so Wirklichkeit, right? But as what? Something that we saw come up before. The universal, allgemeine, right? Self-consciousness of the religious community. The Gemeine. Religious is bracketed there, but what community are we talking about? This is the religious community, which reposes in its own substance. Okay, what does that actually mean? Well, its substance is the people who are part of the community. And one of the things to remember about this, so we talked about this being going to having been, right? A movement of the present into the past. What allows that to take place determinately for human beings? Community, right? It's not as if we're just these totally isolated human beings that sprung up on our own, like mushrooms without any cultivation, didn't require any shaping, any building, didn't require any sort of, connecting up with people. I mean, the mere fact that you and I are talking about this book, The Phenomenology of Spirit, that is over 200 years old and is talking about something that we can actually still make sense out of, means that there is community on community on community. Doesn't mean that everything is a perfect seamless whole, or that we can be schematic about community and traditions or stuff like that, but it sure as hell does play an important role. Our shared humanity, our shared Menschlichkeit, right? This individual man is revealing something to humanity about humanity, and not just to the individual worshiper or even just the community that's there at that point in time hanging out with him and turning into a church, but throughout history. And Hegel himself is viewing himself as part of that community. He's a rather unorthodox member of that community. Maybe we are too. But this is what is going on here. So there's a universality, that community, when it is temporal, when it's not just understood as, well, people have their background assumptions that come from their community, and this is what gives them a hermeneutic structure to understand these. No, it's the day-to-day, going to services, talking about these things, participating in rituals, thinking about these things, wondering if it isn't all bullshit. That is part of this. I mean, think about this. In the very early community, we had doubting Thomas the Apostle, who, when Christ shows up, talk about, aufgestanden, or risen in the Spirit. This guy shows up and he's like, hey, I'm back. And he's like, I'm not going to believe that you're back until I stick my fingers into your side where the wound is. And Jesus is like, come at me, bro. And he's like, go ahead. And Thomas does that. And he says, okay, now I believe, Doubt is not something that destroys the community by itself. It may even be an integral part of it, I mean, think about St. Augustine and all of his, what is this? What was going on here? All of this making sense out of things. And that's what happens in the universal self-consciousness of the community. Here, not quite so developed, but look at what Hegel does say. This is a self-consciousness which reposes in its own substance, just as in it, this substance is a universal subject. We saw this before, right? Substance, subject, spirit, self, these four things keep coming up over and over again. Not the individual by himself, but together with the consciousness of the community, and what he is for this community is the complete whole of the individual as spirit. Let's ask ourselves, which individual is Hegel talking about here? Is he talking about the individual human, God incarnate, immediately present God? Is he talking about the conscious individual who is the worshiper? Well, trick question, because it's both. Both of them are playing a central role in the community. So the individual by himself is not, you could say, truly what he is, except insofar as mediated by the community, which is a community of people trying to figure out what the hell just happened here, and who is this Jesus guy, and what should I be doing, and how should I be relating myself to him and to the community of which I'm a part. And Hegel talks about the community itself as having a consciousness, a self-consciousness. It's not just an aggregate of all of the individuals. So this remains to be developed further, but this is an important, continuation of the turning point. Remoteness in time and space is, however, only the imperfect form in which the immediate mode of existence is given a mediated or universal character. It is merely dipped superficially in the element of thought. It is preserved in it as a sensuous mode and not made one with the nature of thought itself. It is merely raised into the realm of picture thinking, for this is the synthetic combination of sensuous immediacy and its universality or thought. Here in paragraph 764, Hegel is both giving us a caution, but also showing us how the community is indeed making progress towards what we're ultimately wanting out of Christianity, out of religion in general, out of spirit, and getting us ready to move into the final section of the work. Now, this is a short paragraph, so there actually isn't that much to be said about it. I think it's fairly straightforward to explain. And I think one of the really interesting things here is, first of all, I do like how Miller translated this. I sometimes get on his case about being a little bit too periphrastic and adding things or subtracting things or changing terminology. This is one where I think it's actually quite good. Remoteness in space and time, right? If we wanted to be much more literal, we would say like spatial remoteness, time remoteness. But this is a nice phrase. So Vergangenheit, right? The case, the condition of having, moved into this past that we've just mentioned in the previous paragraph, which is in some parts preserved through the community, not just the individual and their memory, but through the community. And if you consider Christianity and the fact that it survived past the death of its founder, and then resurrection and ascension, and then, the first generation of people who actually knew the guy, and then, it continued on past that, a community is what allows that to happen, right? So Vergangenheit doesn't become Vergessenheit, just forgetting about everything. And then, it should be Entfernung, right? That is, a distancing in space. And, you think about the need that these Christians, have to go to the Holy Land and see where Jesus maybe was born, and maybe this happened here, and, all those sorts of things. And people do this with all sorts of other historical matters, too. They go on pilgrimages, and it can be for more secular things. Americans go to the Gettysburg battlefield because they can't really imagine things in their head, and they need to, be there on the hallowed ground. Most of us aren't that way. Most of us are at a distance. So, and we're at a distance spatially and also culturally. So there's this remoteness in space and time. And he says that this is the imperfect form. So this is what the community is providing, but it's an unfulfilled, unvollkommene, not having reached its final destination, you could say, imperfect form in which the immediate mode, the Weise of existence, is given a mediated or universal character. So it's a remoteness in space and time is an imperfect form for the mediation, for the universalizing that the community makes possible, holding all of these things together. Here Hegel has kind of a funny play on words, right? It undergoes this dipping, getaucht, right? It's being baptized, right? It's being baptized, this immediate mode of existence, dipped superficially in what? The element, he says, of thought. So it's not as if it's just purely sensuous existence, because if it was, nobody would remember that Jesus guy now. Nobody would remember that Jesus guy 100 years after he appeared, if it was only sensuous existence. There has to be some element of thought, but it can be more or less superficial. And, you think about the ways in which contemporary Christians picture Jesus, and this picture word is actually quite apropos here. Sometimes it's just in this very sensuous way. Sometimes it is in terms of what Hegel's calling Vorstellung, picture thinking, sort of an imaginary representation. That's how you can get some big brawny Jesus who's, got an American flag and guns, or pick whatever other crazy Jesus you want that's not remotely like the original or what the community, in fact, could have made of him when it was sticking to its guns, when it wasn't coming unmoored into a collective imagination that is less about religion and more about something else. So, preserved as a sensuous mode and not made one with the nature of thought itself. So we have a distinction here between the element of thought and the nature of thought. And the nature of thought is not being attained yet, because what is the nature of thought? Concept, Begriff, begreifen, right? The notion of the notion that we saw invoked earlier, just a few paragraphs before. That we haven't gotten there yet. We can see it on the horizon, but we're not there. So he says it's merely raised, this sensuous mode, this Weise, right? Imagining Jesus hanging out with you and, you're doing whatever, walking along the seashore, eating fish together, learning from the master. It can be raised into picture thinking. That's an achievement. That's better than just merely sensuous existence. So it's raised into the realm of picture thinking, right? And then Hegel tells us something a little bit about picture thinking here, which is kind of nice to know. It is a synthetic combination, a Verbindung, a bringing together, right? It's not just a Bindung. It is a Verbindung, a intense combination of sensuous immediacy and the universality or thought. Picture thinking, representation, Vorstellung, always contains something universal about it. It's more than just, hey, I'm seeing this. It's a, we're seeing this, and it looks like this, and we can move from seeing to describing, or, we can say, well, what's really essential in this? That's also involved in picture thinking, but picture thinking just doesn't go far enough. It remains tied to this Vorstellung, and we're going to see why that's a problem in the following paragraphs, particularly why it's a problem for religion and for Christianity.